all, this implies that somehow the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust were a kind of a sacrifice, an uppleasing aroma, to continue the biblical metaphor. Does that make the Kohanim of the Korban Ola, the priests of the sacrifice, somehow like us with the Nazis? It's a very problematic term. And in fact, many Jews prefer to use very different terms to describe this event. My grandmother, Alama Shalom, her generation, the preferred term was Korban, which is preferred in the Orthodox circles. Korban is a Yiddishization of the Hebrew term korban, meaning destruction. And it has a strong historical connection in Jewish memory to the destructions of the temples in Jerusalem. It comes from the word chera, sword, but it's a term that's really only used for certain specific historical events, most notably the destruction of the Jews' temples in Jerusalem in the year 586 and in the year 70. 586 before the Common Era, 70 of the Common Era. And this ties the cataclysm of Europe back to this long historical tradition from the temples. In Israel, one of the preferred terms is Shoah, which does not have a lot of this theological baggage. And many scholars are really trying to work with different terms, but Holocaust seems to be the term that we've settled. So I'm going to use that term, even though it has certain caveats. We also have to figure out exactly when are we defining the Holocaust. We could make a reasonable argument to say that the Holocaust begins, with Hitler's rise to power, with the Nuremberg laws, definition of who the Jew, with Kristallnacht in 1938, with the onset of World War I in 1939, or we can make a very good argument for the beginning of mass murder, which doesn't occur, as we shall see, until 1941. So it's a very difficult thing to actually pin down in specifics, because that's when you get into the difficulties of interpreting this event. But we will use the term Holocaust and loosely describe, you will understand it as the Nazi attempt to eliminate the Jewish presence in Europe, primarily through the mass murder process that continued from 1941 to the very end of the war. Looking at the origin, the very first place we have to start is really the First World War. One might like to think of World War I really as World War II, Part 1. Even though at the time it was considered the Great War, amazingly it was called the War to End All Wars, it had a tremendous impact on the frustration of the interwar period that led to World War II. Have a look at this map. You see on the left, this is basically what Central Europe looked like before World War I. Major empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, a dual monarchy, and Russia. And immediately after World War I, in the context of the peace treaties of Paris and Trianon and elsewhere, you can see on the right-hand side that Germany is carved up. In fact, Eastern Prussia is separated from Germany proper by a land bridge given to Poland, so it would have an outlet to the sea. Poland is created completely out of whole cloth, resurrected from its 18th century map. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are carved out of Russia, as is a big chunk of Romania, as you can see there. Austria-Hungary is shrunk to just a fraction of its regional size, and out of the remnants of that empire created whole new countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and so on. And this was an extremely unworkable system, even though the thinking behind it was to give more self-determination to the many multinational ethnicities that are living in these empires. It really led to a tremendous degree of frustration. And there were some strange kind of phenomena. For example, about 2/3 of the citizens of Poland were not even Polish. And similarly, about 2/3 of Austria's citizens lived outside of Austria. The capital of Lithuania, the capital city, was located in another country. And there are all kinds of strange things that were associated with the map. So the losers of World War I, in particular Germany and Austria, felt that they wanted to revise these treaties, they wanted to revise these maps, hence they were called the revisionists. And they were constantly pressing to try and address this negative. Hitler was perhaps the most prominent of those revisions. Here's an amazing picture of him as a baby. This is, sort of a sobering thought to think of him as a child like this who grew up to be such a tremendous monster. He was Austrian in background. His father was a minor government functionary who died when Hitler was a young boy. And Hitler was kind of a difficult child. Uh, his father really wanted him to get kind of a safe government job, but he was insistent on being an artist, something for which he had remarkably little talent. And in fact, he was rejected several times by the Vienna School of Art, which he felt was a result of the Jews' activity, that somehow the Jews had denied him his possibility of furthering his career. During World War One, he was wounded and served with distinction, although he did not get promoted too rapidly, primarily because of his very insubordinate nature and his difficulty in following orders. If you look at this interesting picture here, this is from the Alexanderplatz in Munich at the onset of World War One, and the historian Alan Bullock looked very carefully at it, and he found with a magnifying glass that there was Hitler pictured in the circle there, and you can see he's obviously, like so many Germans of the time and so many allies as well, the English and so on, he was thrilled with the prospect of going to war. He was wounded, primarily in a mustard gas attack, and he bore a very strong memory of that attack, and it really had an impact on his thinking later with regards to Jews. After the war,
Caspian Sea. Caspian Sea. Yo, hey, how are you? Taking names. All right. So what happened overnight? So here's the cool thing about just being rabbi is when I sleep, sometimes when I wake, it's like a time machine, and I get to check my inbox and all this other shit. And a lot of times there's really cool shit in there. So I don't know if I told you this. I think you had fallen asleep. By the way, Riser says hello. I mean, he didn't like specifically say that, but he was like, "Oh, you should have messaged me when Caspian Sea came in." Dog, I am not your administrative assistant, so good luck with that. But come in here whenever you want. So that's tight. Hey, welcome. That's cool. I'm happy when people do that kind of stuff. It just tells me that there's interest. All right. So quite surprisingly, like some things happened. Okay, so while you were asleep, I just went out on Harry Potter Obama Sonic 10 Inu, like in the middle of the night, and just started pumping the fucking coin and pumping my views. And so I went from like, this is nothing, but each one of these views is really important. They're like crypto people or something like that, and then additionally, they're like part of the community, so it should pump them up as well. And it was at like 50 and like this time yesterday, and it's at like 190 now. So I'm happy with that. I mean, that's great. Better 190 people who like it than 190,000 who think I look like a doofus. So but if I would could care less, make me look like a doofus in front of 190,000 people, and I'll be famous. Anyway, so then what? So I check my inbox, and it's literally just a line of people saying, "Thank you for the positive vibes. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for the positive vibes. Positive vibes back to you. Thank you so much." Like all fucking night, people were just responding, and so I just sent them a message back saying, positive vibes and one love, baby, and okay, then what? So I had a message. I'm kind of giddy about this. Well, hold on. I'll save it for the end. What up, Arnold? How you doing, big dog? Arnold won his first. Hey, Arnold, did you watch my interview yet? I will. Okay, so I show speed. No. Oh, tight. You're the this guy's the man. I was pissed. I fucking um. Hold on, I have to focus on this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so overnight I've been live. Okay, so you know who I show speed is, right, Arnold? Excellent. Um. Right. Okay. So I've been live streaming in his stream now for the last like week, and I hold the record for the person who has streamed the most in his VC of any person ever. Okay, I awake this morning to find, yeah, I it just took me like a week. Yeah, dog. Well, wait. So get this. Um, I'm in Aiden Ross's. I'm in a bunch of people. So I'm live streaming this motherfucker's Discord, and when I fall asleep, I mean Caspian C, you saw in the video, and I'll send it to you right now, Arnold. I I show that I built a bot to allow me to stream in their VC and not get when they boot me, it lets me back in. Caspian C, you saw this process in that video, right? If you didn't see it, it's okay. That's fine. You didn't have memorized it. Arnold, Arnold, I sent you the message. So here's what I excellent. So what I did was I looked this morning or and I noticed that I'm jailed and I'm pissed because I didn't do anything wrong. I've just did what I've been doing for the last week, which is just fucking streaming in there. And they're to me, like everybody's got their own opinion, but it's not against their fucking rules, so why can't I do it? I'm not naked, I'm clothed, I'm not promoting myself, I'm not doing not safe for work. I'm not you can't you can't hear me, nothing. So I was pissed. So I go to this one guy who I know who's on the moderation team who let me in last time, and I'm like, "Look, dude, if you want me to fucking stream in there, this is in my chat, but that's what I was working on just now. If you want me to fucking stream in there, then tell your fucking moderators to stop banning me and stop fucking with me. Here I am, and I send him a link to this interview that I just did where I am talking about your moderators to hundreds of people. Okay. Like literally, I have a video of me interacting with them. You don't want to piss me off because I'm getting to be famous enough that I will shit on you publicly. Just ask Tim Cook, just ask Mark Zuckerberg, just ask Jeff Bezos, and the rest of those fucking clowns. And okay, so with that, they let me back in just now. So and they told yeah, it's 39 minutes, so it's not that quick. But then what did I do? So this is the best part. That's cool. I love getting unbanned from shit. There's one thing to be banned. When I've been banned so much, like I'm like an abused child. When you abuse a child enough, it's just you can't really fucking phase them. Like a kid who's just grown up with like just well, I didn't fortunately in real life, but in the digital world, I am a fucking feral child, and I get abused by everybody's system. So when you ban me, it's no big deal. But when you let me back in, oh, is that a big fucking deal in my world? Because it's like I got you, you little motherfucker. And so what did I do? I checked my inbox and dun da da da. One of my favorite streamers in the world, Ori. His name is Ouri. He asked. He said, "Yo, hey, what's going on?" And he said, "Yo, I just read what he said because I don't want to." And normally you're not supposed to read people's inbox messages, but my whole life is online, and that's different. It's a different world where I live and um he wrote, "Hey, I would love to talk on stream. I watched that VOD. Back didn't know you were a genius. How nice is that?" So he thought I was smart, and he wants to speak with me on stream. And he's a huge streamer. He's he's a huge streamer. So I'm really excited about that. Um, so I told him, yeah, I thanked him, and I told him I've got an interview tonight, but if he wants to do it sometime this weekend, that works for me, or I'm pretty flexible. So I think that is just fucking the tits, dog. The tits. Absolutely. I don't know. You do. You absolutely take your time. If you're watching my video, I'll shut the fuck up. Sending positive vibes.
He essentially became a rock star. His popularity, particularly with youth, was pronounced. He had a bold new way of thinking about how Germany had to proceed. He was a brash leader who was associated with modernity. He used airplanes. He revised a lot of the iconography. The implementation of the swastika was an extremely brilliant move, kind of like branding his movement. And he rose to power. He never actually won the majority in any German election, but because there were so many parties running, unlike the American system, which has two basic parties, he was ultimately able to win a plurality, and in 1933, he officially came to power as chancellor. He built on a body of anti-Semitic thought that had infected Germany to a tremendous degree in the Weimar period. Here's a cover of a book published in 1920 by Arthur Dintor, Die Sünde wie das Blut, The Sin Against the Blood, ein Zeitroman, a novel of the times. And this is kind of emblematic of anti-Semitic thought of the period. You see the blonde, muscular, shirtless Aryan who is nevertheless bowed down, healthy but otherwise weakened because he has this massive burden of a vulture sitting on his shoulder. The vulture has stereotypical Jewish features, and the overall message of this cover art, which is just one sample of thousands, is that the Jews are kind of like a parasite race. The Jews are going to, make healthy Aryan Germany sick on the inside, like some kind of tapeworm or some kind of disease, and eventually they will feed on Germany's corpse. Here's another very interesting image. This was actually published in 1921 in a book of caricature of Jews, and the author at the time obviously did not realize that Adolf Hitler would later become an extremely important name associated with anti-Semitism. And I have a feeling that this is actually one of Hitler's own early artworks. You can see in the lower right-hand corner the AH initials, but it's pure supposition on my part. Perhaps some art historian will look more deeply into this. At any rate, you see the image here. The young, attractive Aryan woman, very sad, sort of serious expression because she knows that her fate is the leering, overweight, older Jewish man in the background. That, in other words, Germany, young, healthy, full of vigor and promise, is nevertheless going to be dominated by the Jews, and they will ultimately bring about its downfall. Very shrill, kind of panicked anti-Semitism, very much associated with German anti-Semitism from the 1880s onward. Now, if the great biographer of Hitler, Eberhard Jägel, associated two principal elements to Hitler's thought. One is anti-Semitism. He was absolutely a very devoted and virulent anti-Semite. And the other was Lebensraum. Lebensraum is this concept that the Germans need living space, living room. And Hitler viewed this as specifically a drive to the east. He looked at the tendency of German colonization through regions in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, and he felt that that had to be cemented and had to be formally brought under German auspices. In other words, Hitler wanted to colonize Europe by moving eastward. This map here shows you Europe at its high tide under Nazi control. And you can see it extends across North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Spain is technically neutral, although in this situation, neutrality tends to favor the dominant power, which would be Germany. France, of course, all the way through Central Europe, up to Eastern Europe, including Poland, Baltic states, and when he invaded Russia, all the way up to Leningrad, which suffered a horrific siege, and coming close to Moscow as well. Now, just to give you a very quick overview of Hitler's military strategy, basically what he did was he wanted to avoid a two-front war. He wanted to avoid fighting for Russia in the east and the Allies, France and England in particular, in the west. So what he did was he made a secret deal with Stalin in the late 1930s that said that he would invade from the east, from the west. Stalin would invade the east, and he would simply divide Poland and the states between them. This happened in September. Once his eastern front was stabilized because of the aggression by the Soviet Union, then he turned to the west. He took over France in fairly short order, and once that was pacified in 1941, he double-crossed his erstwhile ally, Joseph Stalin, invading the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. And that went fairly well for Hitler until 1943, when the Russians began to push back, and the Red Army ultimately, together with the American army who invaded from the west, landing at Normandy, that's when out of existence. That's a very the element that led to World War II that was extremely significant in this context. Disastrous policy by the Allies. Essentially, Germany was taking over region after region, violating the various terms of the agreements that Germany had signed in the armistice accords, and it came to a head the Sudetenland crisis. The Sudetenland is a mountainous region to the west of Czechoslovakia, heavily populated by Germans who wished to join Germany because Hitler was really demonstrating that Germany was capable of surmounting the depression, regaining their national pride, and so on. This was, however, an extremely significant military strategic region for Czechoslovakia because whoever controlled those mountain ranges could look down into the lowlands. And so Czechoslovakia, having received those territories after World War I, was not willing to cede them to the Germans. The Allies, however, essentially wanted to avoid at all costs World War II. And so Neville Chamberlain from England went to visit with Hitler, and the Prime Minister returned to England, waving a piece of paper indicating that Hitler has signed off on this deal. As long as he gets to Sudetenland, then we will have quote-unquote peace in our times. And it was a disastrous mistake. Immediately thereafter, Hitler went to war. September 1 of 1939, Hitler bombed Poland, invaded with his famous blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy and or tactics, and Poland fell very rapidly. Let us focus specifically on the fate of the Jews in this context. The first impact of the Holocaust per se was the policy of ghettoization. Ghettoization was the concentration of Jews primarily in urban districts, major cities across Europe. The policy of ghettoization was not uniformly it's reconstructed here where they create their own borders. Relied on social pressure, the fear of being punished, and allies in the non-Jewish population to keep Jews relegated within their regions. Secondly, not to have a really clear policy on what to do with the Jews in the ghetto. Some of the ghettos, like Warsaw, for example, were clearly attritionist in nature, meaning that the Jews were to be housed there, kind of imprisoned there, given very, very few rations to live with, and they were simply to die of starvation, or more commonly, other ghettos like in Poland seem to emphasize production. These are called productionist ghettos, where the Jews were primarily, and was that the Jews were to be slave labor to assist in whatever capacity with the German war effort. Likely The reality is, so the Nazis had a very chaotic bureaucracy. Even though they were extremely particular about record keeping and memos and things like that, they really had a very poor command structure. Hitler's own leadership was really very loose and hands off and allowing people to develop their own policies. And that's why the ghetto experience was so different. Ultimately, however, the ghetto experience ended in deportation to the death camps, whichever kind of ghetto that we're speaking about. Things changed dramatically on June 22nd, 1941, which is the date of Operation Barbarossa. So you can see in this map here, this is after Hitler had controlled all of his Western front and was bombing England, hoping to conquer it. Hitler double-crossed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. He went through Poland all the way from the Black Sea up to the Baltic Sea, through the Baltic countries as well, and he caught the Soviet Union largely by surprise and invaded with tremendous force and ferocity. Now, why this is significant for the Holocaust is because this is when we begin to see the first true acts of organized mass murder. It's quite late, 1941. In the past, there were what were called Einzelaktionen, meaning individual actions, beatings, robbery, the occasional cruel murder, but with the exception perhaps of Kristallnacht, which was a coordinated event, a large nationwide pogrom in 1938, there's really no significant organized activity to systematically root out the Jews and to murder them. That happens in the context of Operation Barbarossa, because what Hitler does is he sends out 4 mobile police battalions called Einsatzgruppen. And these are traveling battalions that have some things like that. They basically are charged with the task of going through all of the little villages, the Städtlach of Eastern Europe, rounding up all of the undesirables, principally Jews, communists, Roma, also known as gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, anyone that was on Hitler's list for extinction, and bringing them out to ravines or having them dig their own graves, you see in this picture, and then they were shot by firing squad, usually using machine gun fire. This occurred throughout Eastern Europe, resulted in approximately 2.5 million deaths. Here you can see the Jews to climb down into the first, and then they are shot from above. Hitler and the Einsatzgruppen also demonstrated many different methods of executions. You can see here, and also in this picture as well. And this is incidentally how most of my own family, my grandmother's parents, and her brothers and sisters made their faith in Lithuania. The Einsatzgruppen did their gruesome work between June 22nd, 1941 and late 1942, principally. But by the spring of 1942, an entirely new method of murdering Jews was implemented. And this is something more that we associate with the Holocaust specifically. Basically, something happened in the fall of 1941. Some historians believe that Hitler saw how successful he was in invading Russia so quickly, and he said, wow, if I can do this, then maybe I can actually murder all the Jews of Europe. It should be well noted that although Hitler had a lot of very extreme rhetoric that was genocidal in nature, the truth is there were lots of experimental gestures made to do other things with the Jews. For example, to expel them, to encourage them to leave. Were allowed to leave Germany up until October of 1940, quite late. That's over a year after the war begins. At one point, there were negotiations to actually take over the island of Madagascar off the coast of southern Africa and use that as a massive reservation for Europe's Jews. And a similar plan was hatched regarding the Lublin region of Poland. But sometime in the fall of 1941, all of those plans were totally abandoned context of the Einsatzgruppen murders as well. And Hitler said, we're going to do something more efficient. It may have come as a result of the euphoria of possible victory over Russia. It may also be a result of the realization that Hitler was going to get stuck in Russia over the winter, which in fact happened, and that would be disastrous for the German military as a whole. And Hitler's thinking was, if we are not going to win this war, if ultimately, like a chessboard, you can see what's going to happen in just a few moves, then let us at least kill all the Jews of Europe. So what seems to have happened is in the fall of 1941, they set up an experimental camp called Treblinka, which was distinct from hundreds of concentration camps that had been designed beforehand. Basically, Hitler had a full network of concentration camps that existed really from the beginning of his tenure in the 1930s. But these were primarily for political prisoners and other enemies that he wished to simply remove from social currents. People died in the concentration camps primarily as a result of people died in concentration camps primarily as a result of misuse or malnutrition. People died in the concentration camps largely a result of abuse, of malnutrition, of slave labor conditions, but they were not designed specifically to kill people from the beginning. This was a new phenomenon initiated with Treblinka, and 6 of these special camps, which were called in German Vernichtungslager, which means to make into nothing camps. These were distinct from Konzentrationslager or concentration camps, where people are simply imprisoned in concentrations. This is a place where the Nazis strove for Vernichtung, or absolute control. The 6 camps are here, Treblinka, Sobibor, and of course the infamous Auschwitz of the Holocaust. These 6 camps were concentrated in Eastern Europe, although as the war progressed, several of the other camps, like Dachau, for example, were retrofitted with some aspects of the concentration, the Vernichtungslager features. Here is a view of Auschwitz, which is perhaps one of the most notorious of those camps. The feature of the death camp, which was most well known, of course, the gas chambers. Jews and other undesirable, many non-Jews were also imprisoned in these camps. Once again, the Roma slated for destruction, the Slavs, dissenters, homosexuals, you name it, all kinds of people who were were sent to these camps. But Jews constituted a very significant population. Shipped ghettos all over Europe in railroad cars, sometimes several days to reach the destination. Jews were disembarked, and they were exposed to a selection process where the vast majority of them were sent for immediate Guinness. Whatever was valuable on their person, including prosthetic eyeglasses, sometimes hair, sometimes tattooed skin, whatever was felt of potential use for the Nazis was taken from the Jews, and then often with various groups, giving them towels and soap, for example, and telling them they were going to be deloused, they were going to be lice removed, because lice was a perennial problem on prisoners during the war. They were sent into these gas chambers exposed to this poison, Zyklon B, or Zyklon B in English, which is essentially a rat poison. In the gas chambers, like this one here, they would be asphyxiated by the gas, and within half an hour they would be dead. Their bodies would be removed by other Jewish candidates, the so-called Sonderkommando, and then they would be sent to the crematoria for disposal. The crematoria were not designed to kill Jews, they were designed to get rid of the tremendous number of bodies that would accumulate every single day in these camps. There were Jews who survived the concentration camps, or the death camps, primarily because a certain small proportion was selected not for immediate destruction, but for either scientific experimentation. The notorious Professor Engel, the White Angel, Josef Mengele, for example, liked to experiment on identical twin children. He would expose one of them to various injecting with various chemicals and so on, and then compare the changes with the child that was infected. They also experimented with different kinds of field transplants, amputations, and things like that. Or they used them for slave labor, because all of the camps had some kind of industrial satellite camp. For example, Auschwitz had a small camp called Buna nearby that was used to make acetone. The Jews were used in incredibly horrible conditions as slave laborers and basically starved to death, as you can see in the picture here. The worst among them became what the camp inmates called Musulman, or Muslim, which was a derogatory term used to say that they had lost all will. I don't know why the connection specifically with Muslims. Nevertheless, that was part of the lexicon. And people who reached this stage of extreme psychological distress were not long for this. When the Allies finally came in 1944, 1945, they found, incredible scenes of destruction. People displaced from their homes, their families, from insanity, quite often, and they found incredible swaths of corpses in many of the camps of Bergen-Belsen, for example, which is an entire story in itself. Many students here, I'm trying to keep this lecture under 30 minutes. Finally, the aftermath concluded with the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, where a small number of core Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes. This is part of a larger discussion. I'm trying to keep it within 30 minutes, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it led to a rather extreme interpretation of reasons for the Holocaust, known as the intentional theory, which has come under criticism by another school dominant today called the functionalist. I'll just have to leave that as something for further research. That's basically a very quick overview of arguably the darkest period in Jewish history. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to speak about the borders of Israel. This is
Thank you.
I have a lot of hard feelings over. Obviously, it's geopolitical century, 21st century, and so I'm going to border change on.
Yeah, I didn't understand that one either, but who knows? I mean, it's not like we're on NBC or CBS or Fox or ABC. Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. India. I shot India. I love India. I shot it at India a few times. Maybe. Thank you. Arnold, that is really nice of you. Thank you. I was given it. I was given it. I've never bought any cryptocurrency. I've only ever been gifted cryptocurrency.
Jewish, Christian, and history of the world.
Well, I was in a Twitter space, which is the heart of cryptocurrency on the internet, and they heard me speak to some people from the community. Oh, I'm not like a whale by any means. I own a little bit of, like, very little. You could hold everything that I have in your wallet. Excellent. Take care, Caspian. See you tonight, hopefully. Excellent.
Non-Jews were living aspirations of the immigrant.
I was just given some, so I don't even know. I don't even pay attention to it.
And those non-Jews, Arabs who moved in.
The only thing I've ever used. I don't even care. I really don't. Here's the thing.
the model.
That's fine. Then I lose it.
We look at
It's not so much money that it really needs that much protection. That's how small amount it is.
From its beginnings to the beginning.
I wish. No, nothing like that.
As part of the Ottoman Empire, as you can see. It goes all.
I've never bought, or I have never bought HPOS. I was just given it.
A really significant point in the crossroads.
No, other people just gave it to me as like being nice.
By the end of the 19th,
yeah,
survived any
for the
large
so that's cool.
Come to pass in World War I. At this time, coming up, tremendous efforts of who was a Syrian Jew, who believed very strongly in the political mobilization of Jews to resettle land, primarily as
we're listening to history lectures. Feel free to listen to history lectures.
Up until this point, they were, all over a minority everywhere. So their soul never got to see his vision.
You can hear it in the background.
In the land of Israel, but after World over the region of
take my sound and turn it all the way up.
Jordan, and after nations at that time, they divided up the territory as follows. Here's a really important map. So area on the left, that
baby, I know. Don't worry, I'll have my people call your people.
For settlement. This is in keeping with the British promise in 19.
Don't worry. Don't worry, Arnold. We have a place for you.
Of the indigenous populations, largely an impossible thing to. Which was ultimately.
No, I'm serious. Don't worry. When I go viral, I'll take care of you. So that's all I can promise you at this point. Not even a promise, it's just my words. You'll like me, and if I can make it happen, great. If I can't, I tried my best. I tried more than anybody.
And in fact, that is.
Well, I want you to know that. I want you to know that I do, and I look forward.
At any rate, this is the because we see here.
Peace, baby. Peace, baby.
Area of Jewish settlement and.
You got it, man. You got it.
Moving onward here, what ends up happening is a lot of conflict between the Jews and Arabs and the British occupying authorities. This accelerates throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And after the Holocaust, after World War II, the pressures are just phenomenal. There's a lot of demands for Jewish immigration into the region. And the Arab population has also increased significantly at this point, and there are requests for a break put on that immigration. And ultimately, the British decide to hand it over to the United Nations, much like they handed over the question of what to do with India to the United Nations. In 1947, they come with this rather disastrous partition plan that you see here on the left, United Nations Resolution 181. And that basically divides up what is contemporary Israel into 7 distinct regions. 3 regions shown here in a kind of bluish gray, which were to be for the proposed Jewish state for Israel. 3 regions which are for a proposed Arab state. You can see those are the kind of, I don't know, wow, why did they pick such strange colors? It's kind of a brownish color. And then right in the center, you have Jerusalem, which was simply too hot to handle. No one could agree as to what to do with it, so therefore they set it aside as a kind of international zone, a corpus separatum, or a separate body that should be handled somewhat differently. The bottom line with this map, the 1947 map, is that the Jews accepted this partition plan. The Arab countries surrounding the region, that is Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, did not accept it, and they invaded Israel, and there was a huge war. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of the war. One of the most significant aspects of it was there was military change that drove populations out of the region, particularly Arabs who were driven out. And there were also, political boundary changes, which is what we're going to focus on here. Again, larger ramifications of these changes are significant and still part of the conflict. But just looking at the boundaries, you see that the Israelis now, because we are talking about the state of Israel as of 1948 when the war broke out, the state of Israel actually expands its borders. Not only did they successfully defend their territory, they actually expanded into the areas shown here in purple. So they were able to consolidate the northern region of the Galil, and they were able to expand the Negev region, but they were not able, and very significantly, they were able to push right to the boundaries of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem remained a divided city with the eastern half, East Jerusalem, part of Jordan and heavily populated by Arabs. The western half occupied now by Israel and heavily populated obviously by Jews. And they're kind of sort of an apartheid movement as population shifted across that border. They did not conquer what was called the West Bank, so called because it is on the west bank of the Jordan River, also known as Yehuda and Shomron. And then they did not conquer the Gaza Strip down in the lower left corner of the boundary. So that's basically what Israel looked like from 1949 until the next major conflict, which was 1967. There were minor conflicts or significant but not boundary changes conflicts between them. But the 1967 Six-Day War is really crucial. Basically, what happened in 67 is that Egypt in particular, along with Syria as well, and the other Arab countries around it, planned a massive invasion of Israel in June of 1967. It was very clear that an invasion was about to happen. The UN was powerless or perhaps even unwilling to invest energy in stopping this conflagration. And what Israel did in a very controversial move, but ultimately very successful for the fledgling Jewish state, they launched a preemptive strike against their Arab enemies. And this was an extremely successful war for Israel, hence it's called the Six-Day War. And not only did Israel contain its own territory as of 1949, they actually expanded it tremendously. It was really an amazing victory for the Israelis. Now, looking at this map here, you see that they did two different things with the territories that they conquered. The territories that are labeled on the left were occupied. Those are the huge Sinai Peninsula, which borders on Egypt. It's largely a desert, but nevertheless is a very important buffer region for military attacks. The Gaza Strip, which is, unlike the Sinai Peninsula, highly populated. And finally, the region we know as the West Bank was occupied. And the thinking was occupied for now until we figure out what to do with it. A lot of Israelis believed that a phone call would come almost immediately from the defeated Arab states saying, fine, let's make peace. Let's go beyond what was merely an armistice. That is a ceasefire in 1949, and let us actually solidify our relationship, and you will have the right to exist, and we will have secure borders. That phone call did not come, but those regions were kind of like waiting to be dealt with. In the case of the Sinai Peninsula, as we shall see, it was ultimately given to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty, but no such arrangement was made ultimately for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, those are areas which are occupied, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. Two regions were annexed, and this is quite distinct from occupied. Annexed means that these regions were formally incorporated permanently into the territory of Israel. And those two regions are East Jerusalem, which has an incredible spiritual, political, and emotional significance for Jews, as well as for the Arabs living in this region who are now using the term Palestinian specifically to define the indigenous populations. And also the Golan Heights, which has military significance because it's a mountainous region that overlooks the lowlands in Syria to the northeast and overlooks the lowlands in Israel to the southwest. So whoever controls the Golan Heights has, at least with conventional weapons, a huge military advantage. So those regions were permanently annexed to the state of Israel. But the occupied territories were still waiting for some kind of final resolution. Much of that resolution occurred in 1978 when Anwar Sadat, shown here in a famous photograph, shaking hands with his interlocutor Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, with the American President Jimmy Carter in the center, called up each other, and they ultimately made a peace treaty. That peace treaty was between Egypt and Israel, obviously, and the main territorial concession on Israel's part was to give up the Sinai Peninsula. As you can see in this map, it was ceded to Egypt in 3 stages, Zone A, B, and C. Was not an extremely difficult thing for Israel to do because it was largely unpopulated, although there were some extremely emotional moments for Israelis who felt that the Gaza territory should be retained and had begun settling there. The Gaza Strip, however, was not something that Egypt wanted to reclaim, and so it remained under Israeli occupation. A very difficult status for it to occupy, both for the Gazan Palestinians and also ultimately for the Israeli occupiers of that territory. Another change happens in 1993 when, after the fall of the Soviet Union, changes a lot of the geopolitical dynamic of the region. Yitzhak Rabin, shown here, the Prime Minister of Israel on the left, reaches out to his counterpart, Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And with the sponsorship of American President Jimmy Carter in the center, they also have another classic photo shoot of shaking hands, and that results in a peace treaty that's not nearly as successful as the one that Israel has with Egypt. Basically, this creates a Palestinian autonomy or a Palestinian authority, and the thinking was that this would be a roadmap. This is a term that many of the Western powers use, a roadmap to an eventual 2-state solution. Israel and Palestine living side by side with secure borders. And they looked at the map of Israel and specifically looked at the demographic density of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in particular. And the thinking was that so a certain amount of territory would be given over to Palestinian control, and with trust-building measures on both sides, ultimately that authority would expand and expand until ultimately there was a Palestinian state. Those trust-building measures did not work. There was a lot of internal fighting among the Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank, and with both regions. There was a lot of hard feelings for the Israelis, particularly when the construction of a huge wall began to separate Israel proper from the West Bank, which was felt by many Palestinians to be an unfair arrogation of territory to Israel. And ultimately, the Palestinian Authority has not succeeded in overcoming the objections to its existence. And ultimately, Israel and the Palestinians have yet to formalize anything near a 2-state solution. And this is before we even talk about Jerusalem, which is hotly contested as the capital of both the state of Israel and the potential state of Palestine, nor does it address the issue of the return of the refugees from the 1948-1949 war and their descendants, many of whom are still living in refugee camps in Arab states surrounding the land of Israel. So it has not been a success like the arrangement with Egypt has been a success. The last major political change up until the point when I'm recording this video is the controversial disengagement from Gaza that was effected in 2005 under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. The Gaza Strip, as I've intimated over this lecture, has always been a very problematic territory for Israel. The Jews are highly outnumbered in this densely populated and very close quarters urban region. Now, there were several successful economic ventures run by Israelis in the Gaza Strip, but the cost of maintaining those settlements and both in terms of material, financial resources, and also to a certain degree the political will of most Israelis who viewed many of the settlers of Gaza, the Jews who had settled in Gaza, to be ideologically very radical and not representing the best interests of Israel when it comes to an eventual peace treaty with the Palestinians. Ariel Sharon looked also at the demographic factors that the Palestinians were reproducing at a much higher rate. They had a higher birth rate than Israelis, and ultimately the problem of the demographic imbalance between Jews and Palestinians in Gaza was only going to get worse. That also is combined with the fact that Gaza has a much more radical political climate than the West Bank, and in fact, Gaza and the West Bank are still at war with each other as I record this video. And so ultimately, Ariel Sharon made the controversial decision to simply remove all troops from Gaza. And Israel still controls its borders, which is found to be very difficult for the Gazans living there. There are blockades, for example, of various ships that want to bring aid to Gaza, and Israel contends that they're bringing military aid as well as humanitarian aid. So Gaza is in a very dire situation with no clear outlet at the time that I'm recording this. So if we look at the map of Israel kind of in summary here, you see basically what happened is on the left, this is sort of what it looked like before Israel was a state. Hence it's called in this map Palestine Transjordan, because this region was given to the British by the League of Nations to determine how to sort out the claims of the Jews and the Arabs who wanted this territory. Then in the center map, you have the 1947 plan, which is kind of in the yellow. And then after the war of 1948-49, the orange territories are given to Israel, or the orange territories are taken over by Israel. And then in 1967, which is not shown here, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, which is not labeled, and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Golan Heights up towards Syria, is conquered by Israel. And then on the map on the right, you see what it looks like basically just before 2005. Egypt gets the Sinai Peninsula back as a result of their 1978 peace treaty. The Golan Heights is taken over by Israel and annexed along with East Jerusalem. These happened in 1967. Also shown here, once we're looking at the top of the map, Lebanon is a very destabilizing country in the region, and the Israelis did fight a couple of wars with Lebanon, and so they established a security zone there, which is not considered part of Israel proper by anyone, although it definitely is controlled by Israel. So the West Bank still remains under Israeli control, with some regions that have some autonomy under the Palestinian Authority. The Gaza Strip, shown here, is simply abandoned by Israel in 2005, although they still control the borders. And that's basically what Israel looks like today. Okay, very complicated topic, very heated kind of topic, but I hope that just looking at the maps will give us some sense of how the political contours of the conflict evolved over the 20th century, and let us hope for peace in the Middle East. Okay, I hope you found that information useful, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Gunshot injury, died at the scene. Another child had an adult in the home at the time. Investigators say the 7-year-old did not live there. He was visiting a friend. Shares the partners and the circumstances Two of the kids were taken to a hospital yesterday. The other kids were treated at the school before being released to their parents. A proposal to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour for some workers has been discussed in LA City Hall. The city council committee entertained public comment on a study requested by the council evaluating the possible increase. City analyst Larry Rothschild says if the minimum wage for airport and hotel workers incrementally goes up to $30 an hour by 2028, there will be wide-reaching benefits. These 23,000 estimated impacted workers are expected to spend a large portion of their incomes, stimulating the local economy. Hotel operators and business organizations spoke
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Essential Lectures in Jewish History. I hope you like this beautiful new green screen I have behind me. I can do all kinds of cool things with it. I just got it this morning, and I hope I'll be able to put all kinds of excellent pictures behind me and use it in so many ways that you will be able to appreciate these videos even more. Okay, so over the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to give you a very quick overview of American Jewish history. This is a complicated thing for me to talk about because it's so close to me. It's like right in front of my face. And as historians, we generally like to talk about things that happened a long time ago. The things that happen right now are much more difficult for us to figure out. So we usually give those things to the political scientists or sociologists. And the things that happen in the future, we give those generally to the Department of Prophecy, which is quite a ways down the hall from my office. But let's talk very quickly about American Jewish history. Okay, so there are three significant waves of Jewish immigration, and they are significantly larger as we move on throughout history. The first wave are the Sephardic Jews who come in the 17th century, starting really in the 1650s, and they're tiny little populations that establish beachheads in places like Charleston, South Carolina, or New York as well. These are populations that in many ways were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition as it reached out to the colonies. One of the first populations of Jews that arrived in New York, for example, were Jews from South America who had made it here, petitioned the authorities to live in this region and received extensive rights, especially when New Amsterdam became New York. But these are tiny little settlements of Jews making very, very little impact on the overall population. A more significant population of Jews comes in the 1840s, primarily from Germany. And the Jews who are coming to America at that time are primarily fleeing economic difficulties, economic restrictions, sometimes a certain amount of anti-Semitic discrimination that comes, for example, from restrictive marriage laws that will only allow a certain number of Jews to marry per family and so on. So they come to America to try and, the land of opportunity to explore new options for them. The third and largest group of immigrants comes after the 1880s, and these are Jews primarily from the former Russian Empire. In the early 1880s, there's a series of pogroms, that is, these kind of spontaneous attacks on Jewish populations that the Russian Empire proved incapable of halting over 4 years of sporadic violence. These pogroms, especially in the 1880s, were not huge and extremely violent attacks like we would see in the 20th century, although they would escalate. They would get much worse in 1903, 1905, 1919, and then especially, of course, in the Holocaust. But nevertheless, the fact that the Russian Empire was not able to really stop them was something that was very significant for the Jews of Ukraine, Poland, and regions like that. And so combine that with the anti-Semitic policies of the Russian government and the lack of economic possibilities in the region meant that a lot of Jews sought out the Golden Medina, the golden land that was the New World. And so about 1.7 million Jews came from Eastern Europe to America between 1880 and 1924. At that time, the American government began to really shrink the immigration quotas, and very few Jews were allowed into the country. Tragically, this was also the case during the Holocaust, although many Jews chose to go to other countries, South America, significant number to Israel and the early Zionist movement. Canada, a civilized country to the north, which has, for example, universal health care, things like that. So these are that's the basic three major waves of Jewish immigration. And once again, they get progressively larger. There's a certain amount of internal conflict between the waves of Jews. The German Jews, for example, although very charitably inclined towards their compatriots from, or I should say their co-religionists from Eastern Europe, nevertheless regarded them with some disdain because they tended to be much lower on the socioeconomic ladder coming in as immigrants, and they had to work their way up from, let's say, being pushcart sellers of recycled goods until they finally were able to establish some kind of storefront, and then in some cases even establish large department stores. By and large, the story of American Jewry in America is, did I say that? By and large, the story of Jews in America is a very successful one in which Jews really take advantage of the tremendous opportunities of this land in order to grow their primarily economic situation, their educational situation, and so on. But at the same time, there is a huge decline in religious observance. We should bear in mind that particularly for those Jews leaving Eastern Europe in the 1880s, these were Jews who were bucking the system. These were Jews who were going against the conventional wisdom, which was that America was not the golden Medina, the golden land. It was in fact the Treifa Medina, the non-kosher land, primarily because of its dearth of major Jewish institutions such as schools, synagogues, mikvahs, Chinese restaurants, you name it. There was very little here for Jews coming from Eastern Europe. And so as a result, those Jews who tended to immigrate before the Holocaust tended to come with a kind of willingness to adapt to America, a special desire to learn English, and even to refrain from teaching their children Yiddish, the overwhelmingly dominant vernacular of Eastern Europe. And they were willing to become Americans, to do everything it took to become Americans. This was not the case for the Jews who came after the Holocaust, who were not immigrants, they were refugees. Whereas the immigrant mentality is, I'm open to this country, I'm going to make myself over like this country. This is totally new and different, and I embrace it. A refugee comes with a mindset, my home was destroyed, my culture was destroyed. I will not open myself up to this foreign environment. I am going to make this foreign environment like my old home environment in Eastern Europe. And so there's a huge marked distinction between those two groups. Let's jump ahead a little bit because there's a lot to cover, and I really want to focus on the turn of the 21st century. One of the major stories of American Jewry, besides the tremendous growth economically and educationally in terms of their advancement in all fields of human endeavor, really, is the decline in the character of their Jewish observance and their Jewish identity in many ways. It is a story of increasing assimilation. We should understand that term. Assimilation, if you borrow it from the chemical sciences, essentially refers to like dissolving a solid within a liquid, and so that the solid is no longer visible. That's kind of a harsh term to use when you talk about Jews in America, because in many ways they tend to remain doggedly insistent on certain Jewish markers of identity. For example, most surveys indicate that Jews, no matter how tenuous their connection to Judaism is, they nevertheless retain a high degree of pride in their Jewish identity, and they will strongly identify themselves as a Jew, even if the other behaviors that they may manifest will not necessarily be in harmony with that view. On the other hand, every other marker shows Jews kind of walking away from Judaism. In the 2013, the Pew research study appeared, which was an especially damning report on the state of Jewish identity in America, and it indicated that Jewish intermarriage was well over 50%. And this is a phenomenon that had been observed for several decades. It's at the state where roughly 6 out of every 10 Jews who gets married to a non-Jew. That's a huge figure. Now, obviously, there are differences between the denominations. And in fact, in many ways, America is the place where many of the denominations really flourish. We spoke about denominations in an earlier lecture. But here in America, the conservative movement and the reform movement, for example, grew apace throughout the 20th century. But their intermarriage rates grew commensurately. But their intermarriage rates grew at a commensurate rate with the growth of the denomination. This is a very serious phenomenon, especially when you join that to the fact that roughly 1/4 of all children born of intermarriages, and this is referring to whether the mother or the father is Jewish. Jewish law traditionally ascribes Jewish identity only to those children born of a Jewish mother or those who convert to Judaism. Only 1/4 of children born of a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew identify themselves as Jews. So you combine intermarriage with a low level of identification of children of intermarriage, and you see the Jewish community is in many ways essentially marrying itself out of existence in America. There are other factors involved. For example, Jewish women tend to be highly educated. They're one of the most highly educated of all ethnic groups in America. High education is often correlated with low levels of fertility, meaning Jewish women are much less likely to have children because they postpone childbirth till their education and their careers are well underway. So the Jewish birth rate is about 1.1 overall, well below replacement value. And again, there's denominational shifts in that. The Orthodox birth rate is quite a bit higher. It's about 4 and a bit per family, but nevertheless still a very serious phenomenon for the long-range demographic of the Jews, because Orthodox Jews constitute only about 10% of the American Jewish population. Now, I'd like to spend the last couple minutes of this video talking about Samuel Heilman's thesis. That's an extremely important one for us to understand if we're going to look at the future of the Jews of America. I know I said prophecy was down the hall, but this is a phenomenon that we have observed for the last half century, and so therefore it's worth discussing in this context. Here's basically what Dr. Heilman argues is happening to American Jewry. If you were to look at, well, let's say we make a chart, and let's say on the vertical axis we put the number of Jews. Okay, so higher up on the y-axis you have more Jews, lower down you have less Jews. And then on the x-axis, let us place levels of Jewish identification, which means obviously Jews who are observant tend to be very high on that scale, but at other groups, like let's say quite determined Jewish Zionists or Jewish socialists, people who are really well invested and have lots of daily markers in their lifestyle of Jewish identity, they would score high on that score. So if you looked at American Jewry in 1950, you'd have a significant number of Jews who were towards the non-identified or non-affiliated area of that chart. And then you have a very small amount who are highly affiliated. And you have a big camel hump in the middle of Jews who are moderately affiliated. Those moderately affiliated Jews were extremely important for the maintenance of Jewish life to the right of them, meaning those Jews who were highly affiliated. And I'll explain why. Because if you look at the Jews at the turn of the 21st century, for example, you'll see that there's an even larger group of Jews who are non-affiliated and remarkably low levels of Jewish identification. You have a higher incidence, small but still higher incidence of Jews who are highly affiliated. This might refer to the burgeoning so-called Baal Tshuva movement, those Jews who become observant later in life, which really took off after the Six-Day War in the late 1960s. And so there's a significant number of Jews who are sort of returning to Judaism in very significant numbers. But the moderately affiliated Jew, that camel hump that was present in the very first slide, the very first period that we're talking about, they've disappeared and they're basically nowhere. So that, is a very scary thing for a demographic perspective, but it's even more serious because if you think about the money that those people used to invest in Jewish life. In the 1950s, people who might not necessarily, for example, send their children to Jewish schools would nevertheless give a donation to a local Jewish school because they believed in the idea of Jewish education. Or they might not necessarily visit Israel, but you know what? They would give to United Jewish Appeal. They would give their money, as it were, to the right. In the 21st century, however, even though Jews are in general much more wealthy, the third, fourth generation are much more wealthy than their precursors, their money is typically going to other philanthropic causes. Very valuable ones, but not Jewish. For example, the art gallery or local hospital, lots of causes which are really important for the general society, but they are impoverishing the Jewish institutions that support those on the right. So Dr. Howman argues that if this trend continues, it will be impossible financially for Orthodox Jews to maintain their lifestyle in this country, and they will in fact have to immigrate to Israel. That's a very dire kind of prediction. At any rate, that's a very quick overview of American Jewish history from its beginnings in the 17th century with emphasis on the early 21st century. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you love this new green screen. I'm going to have so much fun with it. Okay, I'll talk to you in the next lecture.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're well. I'd like to talk today about Soviet Jewish history. And unlike most of the other things I talk about in this series, I actually know a little bit about this because I did my dissertation work on the Jews of Ukraine during the period of the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. So I'll try to talk fast and really only say the things that are most important so that you get the essential lecture in Jewish history. Okay, so let's think about what do we mean when we say Soviet Jewish history. The Soviet Union was a transformed Russian empire that emerged after World War I. It had a revolution in 1917 that overthrew the Tsarist Empire, also known as the Russian Empire. And it lasted until 1991 when it finally fell apart for a variety of reasons that maybe we'll have a chance to touch on. It's not really appropriate to refer to it as Russia per se because the area is made up, by the way, it's a large area, it covers 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. We're talking about a massive amount of territory, and it covers many different ethnicities who are not at all Russian, and in fact, many who are not at all happy about being included in Russia in one form or another. So we'll speak about the Soviet Union, prior to that, the Russian Empire or the Tsarist Empire. So anyways, there was a revolution at the beginning of 1917 as people were very upset with the costs of war, with the declining economy, and that overthrew the Tsar and put in place a provisional government. That provisional government lasted for about half a year and then was overthrown again at the end of the year. Now, you may notice I haven't mentioned specific months because the Russian Empire was literally behind the rest of the world by 11 days in the 20th century. They used an older calendar that had been revised by Western Europe a millennium earlier, and so they what they called February was actually what the rest of the world called March, and what they called October was called by the rest of the world November. That just gives you a sense of how different Russia was in many ways. At any rate, you have a first revolution in the beginning of 1917, a provisional government that was not especially effective, and then that concludes with another revolution, which is really the Communist Revolution. The Communist Revolution, led by a man named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, represented an attempt to take the socialist principles of the Jewish author Karl Marx, Jewish but anti-Semitic. He was the classic example of a self-hating Jew, and I have a lecture on that. You can check it out if you like. Anyways, they attempted to put socialist principles into practice with this idea of shared wealth, this idea of shared resources, of nationalizing industry, of deprivatizing, collectivizing agriculture, all kinds of things like that. In the first couple of years after the revolution, this was really impossible because World War I was still going on, and while they were hemming and hawing, the Germans were occupying a large portion of the Russian Empire. So they were engaged for the first couple of years in a period they called war communism, which represented an attempt to dramatically and rapidly introduce communism to the population, which was really quite upset about in many ways. There was a heavy atheistic campaign, which would later be expressed in a magazine with the interesting title Bezbojnik, which means the godless. The Hebrew title or the Yiddish title was Apikoiris, the heretic, in which there was a tremendous amount of violence done to religious individuals and their institutions. Churches blown up, things like that. Synagogues ransacked for holy books and then transformed into, public halls for theaters, things like that.
War communism ended about 1920 when the war and the Civil War had slowed down. Let me mention the Civil War in a second. And that was followed by a period called the New Economic Policy, in which a lot of the communist doctrinaire ideas of war communism were sort of stepped back because the population was simply not having it. And these kind of restrictive policies were relaxed for a while. Now, let me talk very briefly about the Revolutionary years and the Civil War, because it's an extremely important period in Jewish history. Basically, when the Russian Empire fell apart in the beginning of 1917, and especially when the Communist Revolution happened at the end of 1917, Jews were in a very unusual situation. They constituted a significant minority in the overall population, but an especially important minority in the urban centers. As we've discussed many times before, Jews tend to be concentrated in urban areas, and they tend to also be quite literate. And as a result, you've got these islands of Polish, Jewish, Russian cities surrounded by, for example, Ukrainian peasants or Polish peasants and things like that. And the Jews were a very important element in the actual life of these cities, and their high literacy rate meant that they had especially important roles to play in the functioning of this burgeoning new post-Russian Empire government. Several of these emerging states that were built up temporarily after the fall of the Russian Empire, most significantly Ukraine, but also in many ways the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and of course Poland, experimented with giving communal rights to Jews in exchange for their help with nation building. Ukraine had by far the most aggressive and ambitious program, declaring Yiddish a national language, establishing a Ministry of Jewish Affairs that would sit within the government. Fascinating period that I actually spent a lot of time writing about, and you can check out my book. It's probably still in print somewhere. I think it's being translated into Ukrainian right now. At any rate, that whole kind of bold and exciting new creativity ended in tremendous tragedy because these incipient governments could not control the violence in the countryside. And the violence was incredibly overwhelming. There were many different armed bands roving across the countryside, particularly in Ukraine, that were associated with one force or another, including the so-called white armies, which wanted to bring back the Tsar, to roll back the communist revolution, the pro-Ukrainian Directory armies that wanted to keep in place the new Ukrainian government, anarchists that were especially significant in certain regions around the Dnieper River. You had the Red Army was also quite active in that region. Of course, they eventually would be ultimately successful. And there were bands of hooligans and all kinds of groups that were just wandering around. And since there was no government, no power that could really effectively control the violence, it exploded in a sea of blood. By conservative estimates, there are about 50 to 60,000 Jews killed. It's quite likely that the number is significantly larger, although we lack really solid census data to get a solid handle on it. Be that as it may, there's no question that the violence of the year 1919 eclipsed anything that happened in the last 1,000 years prior to it, including the 1648 Khmelnytsky massacres, including the Crusades, and so on. It was a period of tremendous and horrible violence perpetrated not only against Jews, but also against other minorities, such as Mennonites, Poles, and others. And as a result, it's unfortunate, just to step back and think about this historiographically for a minute, this violence has largely been occluded by the much more horrific violence of the Holocaust. But there's no question that the two periods are very closely related, and many historians have begun to have a closer look at 1919 in particular to understand how that influenced the later growth of violence in the region. At any rate, the Red Army ended up victorious. Many Jews began to support the Red Army and, by extension, the communist movement, primarily because they were the only army that was able to establish order in the region. And order is extremely important for all minorities because that's the only way that they can have a safe living space. And the Soviet Union began apace in the 1920s. I've already mentioned now, let's go back to our kind of timeline. So you have the war communism period, which is kind of like 1917, 1918 to 1920 or 1921, depending on how you want to count it. Then you have the new economic policy, which is like 1921 to about 1924. And unfortunately, during this time, which was kind of like a relaxation of communist principles, Vladimir Lenin had a stroke. And he spent about 2 years being really incapacitated, and his deputies began to jostle with each other for control. Most important were Trotsky and Stalin, and ultimately Trotsky lost and Stalin became the new leader of the Soviet Union, which he led until his death in the early 1950s. Stalin was no friend of the Jews. Stalin was an incredible anti-Semite, particularly in the sense of wanting to destroy their national specificity. He did have, the ability to work with individual Jews who had adopted communist ideals, but the idea of a Jewish community, the idea of religion was anathema to him. Even though he himself was a former seminarian, there's a whole story involved with that. At any rate, during the 1920s, while there was still this sort of struggle as to who would control the Soviet Union, there was a brief flourishing of cultural activity among many minorities, not only the Jews, but also the Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles. All these various national minorities had an unusual period of creativity that was determined by a policy called korenizatsiya, or rootification, roots in the sense of like plants. The idea being that Marxism recognized the authenticity of indigenous cultures, which in this case would refer to, for example, Yiddish Jewish culture, devoid of all religious elements. So a tremendous amount of money and energy was poured into trying to encourage Jews and other minorities to develop their cultural activities insofar as they were consistent with the values of communism, which meant, of course, stripping them of any religious environment, stripping them of any kind of hostility with other nationalities, because this was to be the period of druzhba narodov, the friendship of peoples, things like that. And it was like a huge renaissance of Yiddish culture in particular. This extended throughout the 1920s until Stalin really gained control, and he put his foot down. By 1930, all of these various sections of the Jewish Party, including the Jewish section of the Communist Party, abbreviated under the term Yevsektsiya, Yevreisky Sektsiya, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, they were shut down, and you go into a period of darkness as Stalin begins to initiate the so-called purges. The purges were a horrible, terrible time in Soviet history when Stalin encouraged individuals to rat on their neighbors, in some cases even rat on their spouses, their parents, their siblings, incredible, horrible things where people would be accused of being saboteurs, of wrecking the economy. There's a lot to say about this. I'm going to skip through it. But basically, the entire Soviet Union turned into this sort of prison camp where people were suspicious of their neighbors, suspicious of their family members, and anytime a person got ratted out, they would be hauled in to speak to the precursor of the KGB, known at that time as the NKVD, and they would be interrogated, sometimes tortured, and forced to divulge the name of 10 other wreckers. Then these other so-called wreckers, who really had nothing to do with the downfall of the economy, would then be similarly arrested. They would also be interrogated, tortured, and they would reveal another 100 people, and the whole society was going into a spiral of destruction throughout the 1930s. This was interrupted primarily by World War II. And we have more to say about that in the lecture on the Holocaust, but basically Stalin signed an agreement with Hitler that lasted from 1939 till 1941, in which they both agreed to divide the regions that separated them, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states. And then Hitler double-crossed Stalin in 1941, and that began the so-called Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union. At that time, between 1941 and the end of the war, a few years later, Stalin sort of put brakes on his anti-Semitic campaign and his other anti-nationalistic campaigns because he wanted to, try to bring all the minorities together under the anti-war effort. And that was successful for the Soviet Union, which eventually defeated the German army. But in the end, they had to reconstruct the country, and Stalin went back to his old anti-Semitic, anti-nationalistic policies. His death in 1953 was a stunning development for many Soviet citizens who believed that he was the great leader, a kind of a reincarnated Tsar, and his death left all but dissidents really shattered. It's an amazing phenomenon, not for this conversation. At any rate, we go into the next phase of Soviet Jewish history when now at this point, of course, the state of Israel exists, and many Jews are seeking to leave the Soviet Union to come to Israel, and many also want to come to the United States. But in a strange kind of quirk of Soviet thinking, those Jews and other nationalities who wish to leave the Soviet Union are in themselves sort of an advertisement for the failure of communism. Because why do they want to go? If everything's perfect here, if this is the workers' paradise, why would anyone want to go? Obviously, their departure looked bad in the Soviet Union. And so many Jews who applied for exit visas were refused, and they were called refuseniks because they were denied the ability to leave the country to emigrate to Israel or America and so on. As a result of tremendous pressure from the West, especially Jewish communities here in the United States, ultimately, and there's many other factors involved, trade issues, economic issues, military issues. Ultimately, the Soviet Union was forced to relent, and a trickle of Jews in the 1970s eventually became a river, and finally a thundering stream by the time you get to the 1980s. And many of those Jews migrated to Israel, which fundamentally changed the demographic there in very significant ways. Many of them moved to Brooklyn as well, and so that enriched the Jewish civilization in this great city. Ultimately, the end of the Soviet Union came in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and for a host of reasons, once again beyond the scope of these short lectures, he decided that the right approach would be to impose perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, or openness, trying to bring communist policies more in line with the standards of Western Europe and the United States. This proved to be impossible because many of the various non-Russian nationalities living in the Soviet Union really demanded independence, and so by the early 1990s, starting with the Baltic states and with Ukraine, these states seceded, and the Soviet Union fell apart and was reborn as Russia proper, much smaller in territory than the Soviet Union, nevertheless still quite a huge state, and Jews, of course, were at this point free to leave. But at the same time, there is a renaissance of Jewish culture in many of these post-Soviet states. We'll have to leave that for another lecture. Okay, that's your quick essential lecture on Soviet Jewish history. I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
All right, welcome everyone. Why don't we get started? We've got a really important topic tonight. We're going to study the life of the Rambam, the Nesher Hagadol, the Great Eagle, one of the most important and influential figures in Jewish history, someone who cast such a long shadow that the famous statement was, from Moses until Moses, there was no one like Moses, meaning from Moses of the Torah until Moses Maimonides, there was nothing like him. And in fact, since Moses until today, there's no one really like Moses as well. Let me begin with a little joke. I apologize for those of you who are at Shalom Shudis. You heard this. Like Mr. Steve, you're probably the only one. But the joke goes like this. A woman gets onto a bus, an elderly woman gets onto a bus, and as she gets on, the bus driver is very friendly to her. So she asks him, would you like some peanuts, young man? And he says, well, thank you. I think I would like some peanuts. And so she gives him a few peanuts. It's nice to see you. Welcome back. Welcome back to Florida. So then she sits down. Then a few minutes later, they're driving along, and she gets up again, and she says, excuse me, young man, would you like some more peanuts? And he says, that would be really nice. I enjoyed those peanuts. So she gives him some more peanuts. And this goes on several times until finally he says to her, listen, it's really very kind of you, but why do you keep offering me so many peanuts? And she says, well, I only really like the chocolate. Okay, so I'm hoping that this presentation, I'm going to give you all the chocolate and I'll hang on to the peanuts. But the truth is, there's so much to say about Maimonides, and we actually started a couple minutes late today, so I'm going to try and speak a little faster just to make up the time. But we're just going to touch on the life of this truly incredible man and his impact on Jewish history. This lecture is sponsored by the Young Israel of Bell Harbor, Surfside. We're very grateful for the shul to provide us with heat and light, or AC and light, and place to meet. We are looking for sponsorships for future lectures, so if you're interested, please contact me or contact the shul office. The shul likes $200 to offset the costs, and all the profits, of course, go into producing that wonderful edifice that we are creating just a block away. So let's go straight to the material. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the acronym of his name in Hebrew is, of course, Rambam, and that's how he is known to many of his students today. Known in Latin as Maimonides, the IDES suffix means son of Maimon. His first name was Moshe, his father's name was Maimon, hence Maimonides, or Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. His years are 1135 to 1204, born in Cordoba, Spain, and died in Fostat, Egypt. There's some debate over where exactly he is buried. His grave is usually associated with a place near Tiberia, Israel, where they have a special tomb, but the Jews of Cairo believe that he is in fact still buried there in Cairo in the courtyard of the yeshiva where he studied in a small suburb of that town. He was a physician, a philosopher, a popular leader with tremendous courage and conviction. His opinions were highly controversial, as we shall see. His books were even consigned to the flames by other Jews, but at the same time, he maintained steadfast in his point of view, and it continues to be studied today, even though there are many, many areas where the rabbinic consensus differs from Maimonides' point of view. Nevertheless, he is the primary interlocutor for the dominant opinion and remains very significant to this day. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about his life, and then I would like to talk about his literary works, and specifically the Jewish literary works, divide them into two basic categories, and that'll be it for the night. Okay, any questions or arguments before we begin? No hard questions allowed, just easy ones? Okay, good. We'll save the hard questions for later when we don't have the camera running. So his family was a distinguished rabbinic lineage. His father was a dayan, or a judge, in Cordoba. In his commentary to the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides lists 8 successive generations of dayanim that preceded him. And in fact, after his death, he was appointed the Nagid of Egypt, meaning the leading Jewish political figure in Egypt, and that title was held by members of his family for another 200 years after his death. So clearly a very illustrious family with tremendous rabbinic yichus, or lineage. One of the exceptional positions that Maimonides held that makes this even more amazing is the fact that he held that dayanim and also rabbis should not be paid for their services. They should have other occupations. He, of course, was originally a merchant and then later became a famous physician, and they should only earn their keep from their regular livelihoods, and whatever they do as judges or as rabbis should be completely pro bono for the benefit of the community as a whole. This is probably one of the reasons why he was so controversial, especially among Ashkenazi rabbis who took a contrary position, believing that, in fact, rabbis should have a decent, livable salary, and that is a controversy that continues to this day. So he came from this long line of rabbis and of judges, and he never took a penny for his work as a judge in the Jewish community. He was born here, you can see, in Cordoba, in Spain, at the very end of the Spanish Golden Age. We're actually going to go a little bit back in time next week and look at a more central period of the Spanish Golden Age, but for now we're going to concentrate on the 12th century. At the time, the Almohads took over Spain, as you can see, as well as a section of North Africa. The Almohads were known as the monotheists, and they were very strict interpreters of Sharia, meaning they believed that Muslim law should be interpreted with a minimum of divergence for variant opinions. In one area that affected the Jews in particular, the Almohads removed their dhimmi status, meaning Jews since the Pact of Umar in at least the 9th century, according to Muslim tradition, perhaps even earlier than that, Jews and Christians were given special protected status or dhimmi status. They had to pay a little extra in tax, but they were allowed to practice their own religion without fear of persecution. They were allowed to maintain their synagogues and so on. The Almohads removed this leniency for Christians and Jews, particularly in the tricultural state of Spain, where the conflict between Jews, Muslims, and Christians was perhaps the fiercest in all of Europe. And this meant that it became increasingly intolerable for the Maimonides family to remain in that the Iberian Peninsula. So they departed from Cordoba and spent many years first in Fez, Morocco, where Maimonides simultaneously studied Jewish law in a yeshiva there, as well as medicine in the Al-Qayran University. He then spent 9 additional years going from there with his family across the coast of North Africa, ending up in Israel. In fact, I can show you some pictures. Why don't I show you some pictures? Here's a picture of Cordoba, Spain. This is where the Alhambra Mosque, the Alhambra Palace is located. We'll talk a lot more about that next week when we look at Shmuel ibn Ogrela. And then he moved here to Fez, Morocco. Beautiful Moorish architecture. And then he made his way all the way over to the old city of Jerusalem, where he lived briefly. It's not known exactly why he left Israel. He clearly found that it was the high point in his personal career, and he wrote of his time in Israel as a personal, peak in his life. And in fact, he wrote about his ultimately decision or his fate to move back to Egypt with a considerable amount of regret. In some cases, there are letters where he refers to himself as someone who sins every single day, without any specific reference as to which sin it is. Many scholars believe it was the idea of returning to Egypt, which some feel is a transgression in the Torah. But at any rate, he left Israel after a very short sojourn, and he spent the rest of his life in Fustat, Egypt. This is where he made his career and his fame, particularly in as being a jewel merchant, and then later as a physician. Now, in Fustat, even though he did not have a position of tremendous authority at the time, there was a situation in which the Jews and Christians were in tremendous conflict. There was a huge geopolitical conflict that had gone on since the Crusades at the end of the 11th century, and one of the smaller battles between those two religious groups was that a Christian king had taken captive an entire city in northern Egypt, and that held a significant Jewish population. Maimonides took a leadership role from Fustat, and he arranged for a huge collection of cash from the Jewish communities of Egypt, and was able to secure the release of the Jews who were taken captive. For this, he received tremendous prestige and respect, as well as significant remuneration, because he was called upon to serve in many different capacities as a communal leader. And ultimately, he chose to invest his funds in a gem business that his younger brother David would run. Maimonides had told his brother that he should specifically pick up his merchandise at one particular location. I believe it was somewhere in Arabia. But when David went, so he gave him a huge pile of money to go and make this purchase, which he then would bring back, and of course he would live off that. As it happened, David traveled to this location, the name of which escapes me right now, and he found that the merchandise was not up to par, and so he elected to go on a much longer voyage to India, where rumor had it there was much more fine merchandise to be had. Unfortunately, his boat sank sometime in the year 1169 or 1170, and he never returned, and the family fortune was lost. This was a cause of tremendous grief to Maimonides. He describes how he fell into a deep depression for about a year. He was inconsolable because this younger brother was, he raised him on his knee, and he was his student as well. He left behind a wife and a young daughter. And Maimonides was quite crushed by it, and he describes still mourning for him even 9 years later. But at any rate, the reversal in family fortunes meant that he had to find a new career, and so he had been taking quite a bit of medical training in Fez and also in Cordoba before they even left. So he decided to turn his hand to medicine, and he turned out to be extremely successful at this, eventually becoming the court physician to the Grand Vizier and ultimately to none other than Sultan Saladin himself. There are even some interesting sources that argue that Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king, wanted to bring Maimonides into his own employ, but there's no real significant basis for that. There is an interesting citation that's bruited about that Maimonides even converted to Islam in the course of his wanderings before he became Nagid. I'm just walking back a little bit now chronologically, but there's a lot. I should just dispense with it right now. The consensus of scholarly opinion is that likely that it is not at all correct, because the Muslims of the medieval period were a little bit like the Mormons of the 20th century, baptizing dead Jews who were killed in the Holocaust in order that they should get posthumous life in the world to come. And so there was something of a tendency among some Muslim historians to posthumously grant conversion to famous non-Muslims in history, and Maimonides was principal among them. There are some scholars, though, who believe that, in fact, he did go through a pro forma conversion, perhaps in the context of the persecution of that era, but that conversion was nullified once he was able to reach safety. There's a lot of texts in Rambrand's own writings, however, that indicates that he had significant sympathy for people who were forced to convert. He has a tremendous amount of space devoted in his writings to urging communities to be tolerant with those Jews who were forced into conversion, either to Christianity or to Islam, and saying that they should be accepted back without any kind of probation. He also wrote that Jews should not live in places where forced conversion is likely to occur. So the preponderance of evidence indicates he probably never converted, but at any rate, he did certainly have a great amount of sympathy for those who did. Yes, please.
You mentioned Saladin. So was Maimonides affected by the Crusades? Because he knew this the Lionheart. And the Jews were peripheral to the Crusades, but they weren't. Where did he fit in that?
So the question, which I should repeat for our internet audience in the Philippines, the question is, how was Maimonides affected by the Crusades? I don't know. I simply don't know the answer to it. I've never seen anything that Maimonides has written on that topic. As you correctly point out, the Jews were basically peripheral to the Crusades, especially later on in the 12th century. The massacres of Jews during the Crusades occurred primarily in the Rhineland, in Germany. The Jews who are not in the region of Israel, of Jerusalem itself, would probably never have even seen a crusader. So I don't know exactly. I've never seen anything Rambam wrote on the topic. Certainly it was part of the larger geopolitical factors involved in the day. It's doubtful that he ever met Richard the Lionheart, but as we read history backwards and we look at famous figures and we try to draw lines between them, that's probably where that came about. But there's no question that he was highly sought after as a physician in Cairo, and his service to the Grand Vizier and then to the Sultan is well known. Okay, excellent observation. So, as I mentioned, he had to turn to medicine as a career. I mentioned all these things. Okay, so I said there's an interesting kind of picture of Maimonides. There's so many pictures of Maimonides, I could have spent the entire class just looking at them. But this is, by the way, the head of a statue that was erected near Maimonides' home in Cordoba. in Spain. In terms of his medical studies, now this is an area that is not well studied by Jews, but he produced a phenomenal amount of medical literature written by and large in Arabic. He followed basically the thought of Galen with the idea of the humors, the bile and good humor and various things like that. But he also was given over to experimentation as well. He didn't rely simply on a theoretical knowledge of medicine. He was very much into observation. Now, this is well before the scientific method was developed, but nevertheless, it was something important to him. He also contributed to the literature a multilingual guide to pharmaceuticals, which represented various herbs and spices and other medicinal ingredients that were used and listed them in a quadrilingual format. I believe the 4 languages were Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, and Latin, which was a phenomenal service to the medical community because it meant that the terminology could be standardized and that what people said in Latin text could then be correlated with what was written in Arabic text and so on. He wrote treatises on a wide variety of topics, often it was commissioned. Wealthy Arabs would commission him to write essentially a manual of how they were supposed to treat their condition. Asthma, for example, depression. He wrote a medical treatise on depression, which is fascinating for the 12th century. A lot on marital issues. Sexuality was something that
Welcome,
people
Frosty. How you living,
and they would
pimp?
often ask him how to deal with their various sexual. Even a treatise
What
on
history? What'd you say? I agree. I hope so. Hey, dude, watch. I just sent you a link. I just did a really the best interview I've ever done. Watch it. I'll watch it with you. Well, I'm a streamer and I'm interviewed by a streamer. So this is as much a stream as you've ever seen in your entire life. But I talk about world peace for most of it. I talk about X Straight Savage. I talk about his community. I talk about Aiden Ross, and I talk about Amaranth, and I talk about everyone on Kick. Excellent.
In all the yeshivas here in Miami, no one could find it. Maimonides' treatise on hemorrhoids. I was looking for it, but no luck. I have to try Wikipedia or something like that to find it. But nevertheless, for the context of the 12th century, tremendous amount of medical writings, really at the top of his field. It's especially amazing when you think about the intensity of his day, which I believe is the next slide here, right? His day, which he writes about in many of his letters, was an incredibly busy day. First of all, Fostat was a bedroom community to Cairo, and he would have a daily commute of about an hour by donkey, which is probably about 15 minutes by car, maybe a little less than that, but nevertheless an hour ride on a donkey to get to Cairo, where he would then spend the entire day taking care of the Sultan and his extended family, the children, the whole harem. These were all his patients, and his whole day would be taken up with this kind of thing. Then he would return home, once again stuck on the freeway on his donkey for another hour. There's no daf yomi on the donkeys at all, and he makes it all the way back, and then he returns home, and his home is filled with local Fostat individuals, both Jews and Gentiles, who have come to him for medical advice. He would spend his evening writing out prescriptions and diagnoses and so on, and then only late at night would he have a little bit of time to study Torah. And somehow, with that small amount of time at night, he wrote these phenomenal works in Jewish thought and philosophy and halakha really mind-boggling in their complexity. It's really hard to imagine how one person could have accomplished all of this in a single lifetime of only 69 years. On Shabbos, he spent the entire day giving people halakhic instruction in Jewish law. So he lived an incredibly busy life, and yet his work was phenomenally prolific at the same time. Okay, pause for questions or arguments, discussions, debates.
Did he ever sleep?
Did he ever sleep? Good question. He wrote a lot about how to sleep. So perhaps he wrote that when he was insomniac, but no, the Rambam's concept of Jewish law was so all-encompassing that even sleep was included in it. I'll get to that when we talk about his literary oeuvre, very significant. So, look, it is right here. This is where, Ms. Abramson, please ask a good question. Not too hard. Yes, he had a wife and he had one surviving son named Avraham, who left a certain amount of writings as well. I do not believe he had other children. I think he had daughters that did not survive infancy, if I remember correctly, but I'm not positive about that. And of course, he was raising the widow and orphan daughter of his brother as well. So he had, several people in his household that he was responsible for. Okay, so what's perhaps most significant for us in trying to understand Maimonides is his Jewish works, his Jewish written works. This is, by the way, a manuscript copy found in the Guinness in the Maimonides' own handwriting. It is Hebrew and Arabic letters, or Arabic and Hebrew letters, excuse me. So it's Judeo-Arabic that he's written with. The Ben Sira Guinness, I think it is the one in Fostat. Yes, I think so. Quite right. Okay, so he wrote two basic kinds of works. He wrote popular halachic works, and he wrote advanced philosophic works. And this gives you a real sense of the dichotomy of his personality and the sort of trajectory of his thought. So let's deal with the first category. His popular halachic works were written in very simple Hebrew. Remarkably easy Hebrew, intermediate, really like middle school level Hebrew. And they were designed to give a large swath of the Jewish population sophisticated and thorough and comprehensive access to the entire corpus of Jewish law. We should remember that one of the huge lacunae in Jewish thought at this time was that there were very few codes in existence. What do I mean by that? The way that Jewish law is organized is that basically it's all found within the Talmud and in successive responsa literature, which we spoke about a few weeks ago when we were talking about the Geonim. The Talmud is not at all organized in a format that we would recognize in the modern world. Basically, the Talmud is like this long stream of consciousness document that has a logical flow to it, but the only way that you can look anything up in the Talmud is if you know the entire Talmud. There is no way to index it appropriately because it's even strange to talk about tangents in the Talmud because all of the Talmud is one long tangent. I'm not exaggerating because you may be studying, for example, the tractate Shabbat, which deals with the laws of the Sabbath, but it's very likely some crucial laws will be found in entirely different tractates that are not titled Tractate Shabbat. It's just the nature of the way that the Talmud organizes it itself. So one of the things that was really missing was a code that essentially took all of this information and organized it in a fashion that people could easily look up the halakha that they were supposed to find. Essentially, like modern books would have chapters and would have sections and would have, paragraphs that are all organized in a logical format. We spoke a little bit about Saadia's influence with the Mutazilite philosophy and methodology a few weeks ago. And the Rambam, although he disagreed with Saadia in many areas, he definitely liked that style of argumentation. So basically, what he did was he wrote this amazing document called the Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand. The word hand, Yad in Hebrew, means 14 because it has 14 books in it. And this was basically a massive code of Jewish law. It was not the first code to be written, but it was clearly the most comprehensive, the easiest to access, and a runaway popular bestseller on the 12th century, New York Times bestseller list. It was such a phenomenal work because it took the entire Talmud, all of the responsive literature written to that day, and put it together in such a way that anyone with very, very basic Hebrew suddenly had access to information that a rabbi of 80 years of study would have. It was a tremendous device. It was not unlike the kind of information revolution that we have today with, for example, smartphones, with access to Wikipedia. That's the kind of colossal achievement that Maimonides did in his Mishnah Torah. Naturally, it was very controversial because, if you'll recall, people were already upset with him because he said rabbis shouldn't take any money for their services. He essentially put them out of business by saying, what do you need a rabbi for? I have the Mishnah Torah. Is this going to come back on, Mr.?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. So that means I'm talking too much. If the screensaver turns on, it means I'm talking too much. I have to definitely go to the next screen. The Mishnah Torah was very, very controversial, as we shall see shortly. He also wrote Sefer HaMitzvot, which was basically addressing the question of what are the mitzvot. I mean, it kind of you'd think it's a very basic question, right? Everybody talks about we have 613 mitzvot in the Torah, Taryag mitzvot, but no one ever counts them. No one ever says, well, what are they exactly? So the Rambam set out and combed through the entire Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and he wrote down exactly what those 613 mitzvot were, and single-handedly created yet another industry of rabbinic scholarship as people disagree about number 247, saying, no, that's not a mitzvah, that's just a minhag, or number 362. That definitely includes 2 mitzvot. Why did you put it together? There's a whole discussion there. But still, these kinds of works, and I should mention also his first work, the commentary on the Mishnah, they represent an entire trend of his thought, saying that the Torah should not belong just to specialists. The Torah should not belong only to those people who have advanced training in the highly arcane Aramaic idiom of the Talmud. The Torah should be something that everyone with just the very basic literary skills should be able to access. Literacy skills, excuse me. So that was a phenomenal achievement in itself, and really he could have rested on his laurels having made this signal contribution to the Jewish people, but in fact that was only when he was starting out. The second major body of his written works, and I am excluding here his letters, of which there are hundreds and say a lot about his personality and his leadership style and so on, but now we're talking more about his formal treatises written for the Jewish world, were books that were written for an entirely different audience. Whereas the Mishnah Torah and the Sefer HaMitzvot were written for the common Jew, the books like Guide for the Perplexed, Mora Nevuchim, were designed specifically for the highly educated, highly sophisticated, but somewhat ambivalent Arabic-speaking Jew of his age. These are Jews who